Welcome to the Bridgehead with Jonathon Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead on AM 530 at 1:30 p.m. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'll be your host for about the next 40 minutes. Now, I know many of you will be watching this current election with great interest. It's the first election in Canadian history in which it's a tight three-way race between the NDP, the Federal Liberal Party, and the Federal Conservative Party. And I know a lot of people are tired of Stephen Harper. A lot of people want to know what to do. And I wanted to use this show to sort of give people a better idea of what's going on, a better idea of how this election's proceeding, and a better idea of what the Conservatives have done and what they're up to. Because I think, at least for me, and I've struggled with this, there's only really one option for me voting, and that would be the Federal Conservative Party. And that's for a few different reasons. Obviously, I have my very strong differences with Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Has actually launched a campaign in 2013 where we exposed his role in shutting down the abortion debate in the House of Commons. He's said again and again that he won't allow abortion to be revisited as long as he's Prime Minister. That is, in my mind, one of the great blots on Stephen Harper's name. At the same time, the last time a bill on abortion, or I should say a motion 312, came up for a vote, nearly half of his cabinet voted for it, and over 90 Conservative MPs did in all, which I think at least shows that the Conservative Party is the home to a lot of firmly pro-life members of Parliament, many of whom actually do want to speak out on this issue, as opposed to Thomas Mulcair's NDP that will allow no discussion on abortion whatsoever, and Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, which for the first time under his leadership does not allow any discussion on abortion whatsoever. In addition to that, we have this euthanasia discussion, which is brought up by the Carter case at the Supreme Court. Now, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for any party to pass restrictions on euthanasia now, but at least we know that there are many inside the Conservative Party that want to, including very high-profile Cabinet Minister Jason Kenney, who said they're working very hard to try and curb euthanasia to whatever extent that they can. And both Trudeau and Mulcair have made their position on euthanasia quite clear. They are in support of what they call, quote-unquote, assisted suicide. It's a part of their platform, and so we can expect no help from either of those parties in the protection of the disabled, the elderly, and the vulnerable on that file. And in addition to that, of course, there's the prostitution law, which the Conservative passed, which I am very happy with, because I think it does a very good job of combating human trafficking, sex trafficking, prostitution. And I'm very concerned that under a Mulcair administration or a Trudeau administration, especially a Trudeau administration, that these protections for human trafficking victims would be rolled back. So we have, a very flawed field. When it comes to the protection of human life, our options are not great. I would hardly advocate some members of Parliament, but I would urge you all to very much check out who's in your area. But in the meantime, I just wanted to give people a sense of the Canadian political field and what's been happening over the last 10 years, since we're really in this exceptional moment in Canadian political history where things are probably going to change quite dramatically. So to have that discussion, I called Tom Flanagan. He's a political scientist who used to work at the University of Calgary. In fact, was known as a very influential Conservative commentator, part of the Calgary School. In fact, John Ibbotson interviewed him quite extensively for his recent biography of Stephen Harper, because actually Tom Flanagan was a mentor and close advisor to Stephen Harper until he wrote a book called Harper's Team. And him and Harper have not spoken since, because Harper viewed that book as a betrayal of his trust. But Tom Flanagan is probably one of the only people who has a pretty good bead on Stephen Harper and is willing to actually talk about it, as well as the fact that he was very instrumental in beginning the Conservative movement, starting with Preston Manning's Reform Party, that led to this Conservative Party that we have now, that's now running for power and asking for another mandate, Stephen Harper having been Prime Minister for almost a decade. So I found this conversation both enlightening and interesting, and I hope you feel the same way. So Without further ado, I'd like to present a conversation with Dr. Tom Flanagan of the University of Calgary.
Last year, you published a book, Winning Power, Canadian Campaigning in the 21st Century. What was your basic thesis in that book, as it seems to apply very much to the campaign we see unfolding around us today?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there's a single thesis. It's meant to be kind of an overall description of what parties do in campaigns and how that's been changing in recent years. So it starts with the idea of using persuasion in order to build a coalition of support to fulfill your objective of getting control of the government, and then it goes on from there about different ways of carrying out that persuasion.
And that obviously happens on a national and on a regional level. And, of course, the polls that come out now about every 8 hours here in Canada seem to tell us which national party is in the lead, but that seems to be at the expense somewhat of taking into account, door knocking and lawn signs and sort of a basic regional level campaigning that often ends up heavily impacting the final debate. How do you think the on-the-ground game is going to impact this particular election?
Well, the ground game and persuasive efforts that are focused on individual ridings have an effect in that they allow you to win close contests. You can't, if you're 20 points behind, you can't make up the difference by more door knocking. But if you're within a few points and you have a vigorous program of door knocking plus telephoning to identify your voters, and then you call back and try and get them out on election day to vote, you can close a gap of several points in the poll. So the party that has a better program at that level is going to win more seats. But it's almost impossible to get a read on that because the parties keep all that very secret. I mean, they all have databases now, and they're looking for the names of their supporters, and they're going to put them in the database, and then they're going to make an effort to get them out. But they're not going to be telling anybody how many people they've contacted or how many supporters they've found or what their plans are to get them out. So that's all that takes place kind of behind a veil of secrecy. And yet it can be very important if you're talking about a close race, as this one appears to be, a party which is more efficient at turning votes into seats and winning the close races is liable to come out ahead.
And would you care to venture a guess as to who that might be?
Well, in recent years, the Conservatives have had a better ground game because they were the first to get into database politics in a big way, starting, almost immediately after Mr. Harper came into office as leader of the Canadian Alliance. The party started building a database to store the information. I mean, one of the problems that parties have had in the past is they lose information from one election to another. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a database that can hold it all and make sure that it's under central administration so you don't lose it. So the Conservatives started on that earlier, and I think they have probably at this point a bigger list of identified supporters from the past. Now people change their minds, but that's where you start with is your list of supporters from the past. The other parties are catching up, I think, but they're probably not there yet. So I think the Conservatives have a couple of sort of hidden plus factors in the campaign. One is that they appeal to older voters. Conservative, of course, support is middle-aged and senior, and these are people who are most likely to vote.
Right.
Conservative and NDP support, Liberal and NDP support tends to be younger voters, and these are people who are least likely to vote. And I mean, the difference is huge. If you take the 18 to 24 age group, your turnout rate will be certainly less than 40%, maybe less than 30%, whereas if you take the, say, 55 to 75 age group, the turnout there will be probably pushing 80%. So you get about twice the bang for the buck, you might say, with older voters. So anyway, that's worth quite a bit to the Conservatives. And then the other thing is their better organized ground game. As I say, the other parties are catching up in that, but I think the Conservatives probably still have a lead. So that's a couple of plus factors that they have that might help them to do a little better on election day than you might think just from looking at polling numbers. But, as I say, these things only matter if the election is close. If it's not that close, these little plus factors aren't going to sway very much. But if it's close, they do make a difference.
Right, and this election has been interesting for a number of reasons. The media traditionally has a bit of a liberal bent to it. Is more a supporter of the traditional Laurentian consensus that's sort of been more or less overthrown between 2006 and 2011 very successfully by Mr. Harper. And in previous elections, you could tell that liberal bias existed, but I think it's quite transparent to sort of any Canadian observer at this point that the media has its knives out for him in a big way this time. It seems that they smell blood in the water, and I have plenty of problems with Mr. Harper, but I find a lot of the narrative that's being played out right now in the media strains credulity, to say the least. I attended, as a journalist, a rally with Mr. Mulcair, for example, in Ontario, and he made quite a few interesting points, but one of the things he kept on referring to was the darkening of democracy and such, and there was no specifics ever given for the darkening of this democracy and why I can't feel its shadow touching me. Do you think that the way the media seems to be all out this election cycle is going to have an impact, or do you think that rather that's going to sort of skew people's perception in a way that we've seen in a number of Canadian election cycles over the last few years?
Mm-hmm. Well, the media, I think we have to be careful about overgeneralizing about the media. They're not homogeneous. The CBC and the Toronto Star, some of the Atlantic Canada newspapers, and by and large the French media tend to be pretty negative towards the Conservatives. On the other hand, the Sun papers are quite positive. National Post is quite positive, not uncritical, but overall positive, I would say. And a lot of the Western metropolitan dailies are reasonably positive, Calgary, Edmonton, etc. So it's not the media is not entirely a hostile place for the Conservatives. It really depends what you're reading or looking at. But I agree with you. There've been a lot of negative stories this time around. How much effect these are having, I'm not sure that they have. Most of them have tremendous effect. I've only been observing day to day the movement of the polls. I'm only able to pick out two stories thus far that, three. Let's say three that seem to have had measurable effect in the party standings. The first one was the Duffy trial, which went on for several weeks in the beginning of this long campaign, and the Conservative numbers, I think, were held down by that. Started to go up after the trial was finished. The second story was the beginning of the refugee crisis, with the picture of the little boy on the beach in Turkey, and Conservative numbers dropped sharply for a few days after that. I think largely because initially the Prime Minister kind of created an impression of not caring much about it, not feeling anything.
Right.
But they eventually got their act together. They came up with a policy which is actually not much different from what the Liberals or NDP are proposing. So I think the ship righted itself after that. And then the third one, which hasn't fully played itself out yet, is the debate over the niqab in the citizenship ceremonies, which I think has had a highly visible effect in Quebec. And the effect is big enough in Quebec that it also affects national polling numbers. And there's a story where many people in the media, I think, are opposed to the Prime Minister, but the fact that they're talking about it works to the Conservative advantage, because polling shows that there's overwhelming support for the position that you shouldn't be able to veil your face when you're taking the oath of citizenship. It's over 80%, it's almost 90% in Quebec, and it varies from province to province, but I think in every province it was over 50%. And it's over 50% among the supporters, I believe, of all political parties. So the people in the media may think they're criticizing Harper, and the Conservatives, the way they cover it, but just talking about it probably works to his advantage, because people read that and they say, "Hey, I think something's wrong here. I don't think you should be able to cover your face when you take the oath of citizenship." So sometimes sometimes hostility in the media can backfire if the media sometimes are on side with public opinion, but not always. The people that write in the national media are not typical of Canadians at large. Their political leanings are quite different than Canadian at large, and so they sometimes pursue causes which seem important to them, but public reaction to them is quite different.
Well, it's sort of interesting because much has been made of the Prime Minister's personality, even though by all accounts he does keep that quite veiled. I've been to different campaign events and various other elections, and I've always heard a very strictly controlled message and a strong adherence to the talking points. Even at the 2011 election victory event in Calgary, he seemed somewhat reserved, whereas this time around, I was recently at a campaign event here in Ontario, and I know that this has been noted upon by Paul Wells and Maclean's and various other peoples too. Mm-hmm. He's never seen more relaxed. He's jovial. He's making a lot of off-the-cuff jokes, and rather than the sort of strict adherence to, specific talking points and the teleprompter reputation, I saw a man very much relaxed and having a good time, whereas at Mulcair's rally, for example, I saw somebody reading a very standard stump speech off of a teleprompter, which I found interesting because that seems to be a reversal of traditional roles. Now, what would you think the reason for Mr. Harper's relaxation would be?
Well, I mean, I know what you mean. I've read people commenting on that. I haven't been to these events myself, but I've read some of the reactions that are published. And why he is personally more relaxed, I couldn't begin to guess. Mm-hmm. In the case of Mr. Mulcair, I think the explanation is that he has tried to reposition his party. The NDP always had the position of being further left on the Canadian political spectrum, quite substantially to the left of the Liberals. Mulcair comes in from outside. He was never an NDP member. He was a Liberal in Quebec, at the provincial level anyway. And we have some evidence that he was actually willing to consider working with any of the three major Canadian federal parties. So he has tried, and has succeeded, I think, in moving that party to the center of the political spectrum, is sort of sitting on top of the median voter, as we put it in political science. Commitment to balanced budgets, dropped the term socialist from the party competition. He's not going to raise taxes except for corporations. That's not to say he's given up all left-wing ideas, but he certainly has given up quite a few of them. And in this campaign, I think he set out to create a reassuring image for Canadians to dispel the idea that you had to be afraid of what the NDP might do. Well, one way you can do that is by scripting yourself. Make sure that you don't say anything that doesn't fit into the picture you're trying to paint. So I think that explains what he's been doing. Now, it appears to be working for a while, but I'm not sure that it's working any longer, because there's still enough left-wing stuff in the NDP, both in their proposals and in their history, that a lot of people are maybe a little suspicious of this suddenly we have this new centrist Mulcair, who never says anything disturbing, but then you read about some of their specific proposals, like the new approach to daycare, and they've got a long list of things, and you ask yourself, well, how would all this be afforded? And reaction to their funding sketch was, people said it was pretty sketchy. Those who studied it left a lot of questions unanswered. So he's kind of given up some passion by trying to project this calm, reassuring, centrist image. He's given up some passion, but I'm not sure he's solved his credibility problem, because he's still dragging around a lot of left-wing policies, even if he is, covering them over by saying, well, the budget will be balanced and we won't raise your taxes.
Right.
There's still very legitimate questions. But, well, okay, so you say that, but how are you going to do all these specific things that you're promising to do? So I think that's the problem that he has. But I do think that his demeanor in this campaign is a result of deliberate scripting to achieve a particular objective. But for Mr. Harper, I'm not sure whether he decided it would be politically beneficial to relax a little bit, or I honestly don't know.
It's interesting because the NDP pivot to the center, if you take that event in light of, and I'm not sure if you've read these books, but Paul Well's book, The Longer I'm Prime Minister, in which he talks about how Harper has been incrementally changing the country for almost a decade, and John Ibisson's recent book, that I assume you've heard of because it quotes you quite extensively, is...
I've read Ibisson's book, yeah. I didn't read Paul Well's book, but I did read Ibisson's book, yeah, because I was interviewed for it.
Right. Paul Well's takes more or less the same stance that Ibisson does, which is that Harper has just changed things so incrementally. And with that in mind, do you think that it's indicative, that Jack Layton's successor, Thomas Mulcair, in order to have a shot at becoming the next Canadian Prime Minister, he thinks he has to campaign on a more or less conservative platform? I think it's probably safe to say this would be somewhat unheard of a decade ago. Yeah.
Well, I think two things are going on. One is that a party which has, as I put it, invaded from the margins, like the CCF-NDP. Of course, this is a long-term strategy. But a party of that type ultimately has to move more to the center in order to have a real chance of winning. They can't be too far from the median voter. They can be far out and exercise influence, but as far as actually winning enough seats to govern, you do have to move in more to the center, unless there is a divided opposition. But the Conservatives have the right side of politics to themselves at the moment. So the NDP doesn't have the luxury of facing a divided opposition. So I guess they felt that and Mulcair does definitely want it to be a party of government. I don't think he's interested in continuing for a long time as opposition leader. He's not a person of the NDP traditional culture of opposition,
Right.
It comes from a culture of being in government in Quebec. So I think it would happen anyway. Now, I'm not sure that Harper has changed the country as much as is sometimes asserted. He's presided over a new consensus, a lot of which, though, was already taking shape in the Chrétien years, like the importance of balanced budgets and the belief that taxes were too high and should be lowered. A lot of these things actually started under Chrétien, and Harper has continued them. I'm not sure that it's all the change here is attributable to Harper being in government. I mean, I know Conservatives would like to think so, that they are changing the country by staying in power, but I'm actually not sure that's true. Sure, you can abolish specific programs, and you can do certain things as long as you're in power, but there's still a thirst for activist government that will give people stuff seemingly for free. I mean, look at the popularity of Justin's deficit idea. The Liberals are climbing in the polls as well as the Conservatives. The NDP were going down, and obviously not everybody favors Justin's approach, but there's clearly a reservoir of support out there. And Justin's principal advisor, of course, Jerry Butts, comes out of the McGuinty government, and McGuinty government played it this way for a decade of more activist government, bigger and bigger deficits, keep the debt increasing. So I'm not sure that any of these victories are ever permanent. Like, talk about changing the country. I actually don't really see it that way. I think you do what you can while you're in power, but I see all political victories as transitory.
Right.
And there's always a reaction against at some point. There may be waves that go through public opinion. They may last for 20 or 30 years, but I think probably I don't know, probably, maybe we're coming to the closing part of a wave that started, well, it was a little delayed in Canada, but it certainly started in the 90s, a reaction against activist government and overspending. Well, it did actually start in the 80s when the Mulroney government privatizing a lot of crown corporations. They weren't able to get control of the spending problem, but they did really important things with free trade and privatization. And then in the 90s and the decade following that, the government got a grip on its spending issue and balanced the budget and started to lower taxes. And so there's all kind of a logical progression there from the 80s on up to the present. But now, I see a lot of reaction against that. Well, I mean, here in my own province, the NDP won the last election, and they're preparing to run the biggest deficit in Alberta history. And Justin he broke with the consensus and is running on the desirability of deficit spending. So I'm a little skeptical of the long-term change idea. I see it more as kind of temporary political victories, and you kind of go back and forth. I don't think anything is ever won permanently.
So what do you think it is that Stephen Harper has managed to accomplish then? You seem somewhat more skeptical than John Ibbotson or Paul Wells or a number of
I think all these guys are a little bit too to attribute too much influence to government. I mean, government has the power to run its own machinery, of course, but government's power to affect public opinion in the long term, I think, is dwarfed by other factors that we don't understand or control. So what does Mr. Harper manage to do? Well, I mean, first of all, he managed to unite the right side of the political spectrum, which created the basis for winning elections. Secondly, his fiscal record is mixed, but it's still true that after 9.5 years in power, the federal government, taxes paid to the federal government as a share of gross domestic product are the lowest that they've been since, I think, Diefenbaker. He has he hasn't shrunk government exactly, but he's kind of kept it from growing more rapidly than the economy, which is an achievement in itself. He has lowered a lot of taxes, sometimes in a rather messy way with all the various tax credits and so on. Sort of hard to keep track of the whole thing, but the result is less tax being paid. So these are all real achievements. He's managed to abolish some damaging programs like the long gun registry or the wheat board's monopoly power. There's quite a list of less highly visible things. So he's done a lot of house cleaning with government programs that had dubious rationales to begin with. He has not touched, only peripherally has he touched main pillars of the welfare state. So he's announced change in age of eligibility for OAS. What's that, starting in 2023, I think? I mean, that's really down the road. And even that's liable to be rolled back by then because the other parties are all opposing it. And he announced not a cap on Medicare transfers, but a cap in the rate of increase to 3% a year for transfers for Medicare, which in Medicare now is the big problem for all the provinces. Medicare is eating the lunch, everybody's lunch. Medicare is costing 40% plus now of the typical provincial budget, and it's getting in the way of basic things like building and maintaining roads and building schools, and it's an unresolved issue. Well, this government hasn't done anything about it at all yet. Just promising starting 2017, I think it is, to restrict the rate of transfer a bit, the rate of growth of the transfers. So the big stuff he's left untouched. He's managed to tidy up a lot of smaller things in government, and he's managed to actually reduce taxes. So it's not a spectacular performance. It's hard to point to one thing like Mulroney. You could say free trade, or Trudeau. You could say the charter. That's a legacy. Harper's legacy is more diffuse.
Right.
A nip here and a tuck there. Lots of little incremental changes, which, of course, many of which may be reversed if some other party wins power. But I say sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. If you've managed to do those things for 10 years, that's something to be proud of.
Right. Well, John Ibbotson and others have made much of your relationship with Harper, probably because you're one of the few that's written openly about that relationship in Harper's team. And like a lot of them discuss your mentorship role and indeed the influence of the whole Calgary School of Thought, as it's called. Based on, your conversations with him as he headed into politics and based on a lot of the ideas that were put forward, how do you feel that his government has performed in those terms, considering the things that the policies you had discussed and the vision for a more conservative Canada? Along those lines, how do you feel the Harper administration should be graded?
Well, he certainly hasn't lived up to the hopes that we had then, but I'm not sure that's his fault. I mean, I think the hopes were probably unrealistic. But he has not made sweeping changes to the practices of Canadian government or the machinery of the state or anything like that. He's left a lot of things untouched. I guess he felt he couldn't. There's only so much he could do. So, for example, the Canadian Post Office, Canada Post, is, I believe, ripe for some form of privatization, partial or whole. Some of the socialist countries of Europe are doing it, like the Netherlands and Germany. And I think the time is here, but he hasn't been willing to move on that. There's lots of things you could point to and say that we, my friends and I in the Calgary School would hoping would happen. And as I say, he hasn't really tackled head-on our major problems of the welfare state, which we're not going to be able to ignore forever with an aging population.
Right.
As I say, he's done a little bit with the OAS and Medicare, but I mean he hasn't actually done it yet. He's just announced it for years in the future. To be left to somebody else to actually do may not even happen. He's left equalization untouched. I could give you a long list of the things that he hasn't done. But overall, I think that he can take pride in what he has done. May not be as much as we had hoped, and some of what he's done hasn't always been well done. There have been some problems with appointments of various people and so on, and his Senate reform plans cratered. And I say you can make a long list of failures, but I tell you, it's so hard to get anything done in politics that people deserve credit for any achievement. So, I wouldn't want to dwell on what he hasn't been able to do. I think it's better to give the government credit for what they have been able to achieve. And realistically, I don't think it's transformed Canada. There's a lot of hype, a lot of exaggeration from Harper derangement syndrome from people who think that he's destroyed the country. I mean, this is ridiculous. So putting it in perspective, he's brought in a number of changes in a conservative direction, and repealed or abolished some unneeded small programs. At least I think they were unneeded, and he's kept the overall size of government somewhat within bounds, and has actually lowered our net taxes. And none of these were done he's managed to stay in power for almost a decade. So I think it's pretty creditable record of achievement.
But the way you put that is interesting. So the thesis of both Wells, Ibbotson, and a few of the more level-headed and less hysterical commentators have said that Harper has built a conservative machine that can outlast him. Now, what I'm interested in is whether or not you think that is true, or whether Harper simply provided a pause, between the reestablishment of liberal governments, because you point to the things that he has done, but it doesn't seem that you think he's done anything quite transformative enough. Has Harper moved to the center to the point where voting for him is no different than voting for the other ones, or does he provide a real alternative, and does the conservative coalition he's cobbled together represent something in Canadian politics that is at least distinct from Mulroney's conservative coalition?
Mm-hmm. Well, complicated question. No, he has moved to the center. B, he hasn't moved so far that there's no difference between his policies and those of the other parties. But the difference is not vast. Look at taxation. He says, well, no new taxes and some continued tax reductions. Justin wants to reduce one part of the personal income tax and increase another part. Mulcair wants to increase corporate income tax. So there are differences, but they're not enormous. But I think the differences are still significant because it's usually a difference of direction. I mean, Harper says, I want to go in the direction of lower taxes. The others want to go in the direction of higher taxes, even if the amounts aren't huge. Well, you start going in that direction. I know from experience that once you start saying the only way we can pay the bills of government is through higher taxes, it doesn't stop with the first round of tax increases because you feed the beast and its appetite grows in the eating. So I can guarantee you that if we have a Liberal or an NDP government, they will be back with other tax increases later to keep feeding the beast. So I think the differences are still, they're not enormous, but they are point in different directions, and I think that's significant. Will it outlast him? Mulrooney's great victories fell apart in the end because he had created what's the word I'm looking for, kind of an incoherent political coalition. The main pillars of that were the very large Quebec caucus and the very large Western caucus, and these two groups had quite different aspirations, and it was almost magical to keep them together as long as Mulrooney did, but eventually they broke apart. Harper's coalition is more coherent. It consists of rural and suburban voters in the West and Ontario, with some add-ons from Quebec and Atlantic Canada. But it doesn't have big regional fractures within it. The potential fracture, of course, is the old fault line between progressive conservatives and reformers, which was patched up under Harper. Now, would that reemerge in the future? I think, I don't know. I think it depends very much on leadership. We really don't know. Harper has not tried to anoint a successor. He hasn't set anyone up to succeed him. And a lot of the most capable people at the top have, for one reason or another, decided to move on, like Jim Prentice, Rusty Baird, Chuck Straw. You could give a long list of the top political performers of the original crowd who have now decided to go back to private life. In some cases it was because they were close to retirement age. In other cases, looking for something else to do. But so it's really not clear who would follow Harper. And my observation of contemporary political parties is that the leader is everything. Without Harper, there would not have been a merger and the current success. What will a successor do? Look at the difference to the Liberals that leadership has made. First Stéphane Dion, then Michael Ignatieff, now the Renaissance under Justin Trudeau. It's all leadership. So who? And we have absolutely no idea who the successor to Mr. Harper might be. So I think it's possible that things would go badly after he leaves. And it's not necessary, but I think it's possible that things could go very badly because there is this underlying fault line, and people have been held together by the benefits of being in power. Everybody was glad just to have won, and so they would often swallow their indignation over something and just toe the line in order to not to disrupt the exercise of power. But once your party is defeated, then there's always different views about what led to the defeat, and that we'll have to see is all I can say.
One final question. Do you care to venture any guess on how this one's going to turn out?
Well, things seem to be moving the Conservatives' way, and to also the Liberals' way. The NDP seems to be fading. I mean, a week later, things may look different. Because
right.
Things go up and down. But when I look at it today, I see a number of things that seem to be working in the Conservatives' favor. They've gotten past the Duffy issue. It held them back at the first part of the campaign, but now that's over, and nobody's thinking about that anymore. I think it did some permanent damage a couple of years ago, but I don't think it's getting any worse. So they've survived the Duffy issue. There were some bad economic numbers, but I think the new numbers for July are supposedly going to be better, so that may give them some sense of momentum. The international situation remains dark. The refugee crisis appeared initially to be a threat to the Conservatives, but they've managed to surmount that. And the niqab issue, I think, is helping them, at least in some parts of the country. So, they've managed to withstand some of their biggest challenges, and they have some things now giving them a little tailwind. I think the NDP has run into its internal contradiction of trying to move from being a traditional left-wing party of protest to a centrist party of government, and they tried to make the move, but I think a lot of people aren't buying it. And then they have this other contradiction between being a national party and a Quebec party, and they're getting hung up on that with the niqab issue, which is hitting them very badly in Quebec. Liberals, I think Justin has performed well in the campaign. Yeah. For those who are critical of his policy smarts, he still says things that don't make a lot of sense. But I guess to a lot of people it doesn't matter. So he's performed with energy and enthusiasm in the campaign. He's done better than expected in debates. So, I think right now, I'd have to say Conservatives and Liberals seem to be providing the main action, and the NDP seems to be fading a bit. Nobody still is anywhere near a majority government. And so, and that's the other thing too, is that this was really two campaigns in one. One was the Conservatives trying to win enough seats to continue in government, but the second campaign is the Liberals making sure that they win more seats than the NDP, because if the other two parties are going to combine to defeat the Conservatives, then who gets to form a government after that? Well, probably the party with the bigger number of seats. So it's crucial to the Liberals to at least become official opposition. If they can do that, they may have a good chance of becoming the government if they can persuade the NDP to vote with them against the reply to the speech from the throne. So the race between the Liberals and the NDP has been as important as the race between the Conservatives and the other parties. And that one, I think the Liberals do appear to be winning that second contest. And if they can come in second in the election, there's a good chance that they might be able to form a government within a few months. But we'd have to see how that plays out. But it's at least a possibility. So, but concluding observation here: recent campaigns in Canada, both federal and provincial, have often had totally unexpected developments in the final week. We're not there yet, so I'm not making any predictions.
Right.
Because the only thing I'm predicting is that there are a lot of unpredictable events take place in the final week.
A very political answer.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Flanagan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Tom Flanagan of the University of Calgary, an author, academic, and former advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. We hope that both the commentary and the interview have given you a bit of insight into the Canadian political system, as well as help clarify maybe your choice coming up here on October 19th. So thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next week.